You're listening to The Briefing, first broadcast on the 23rd of December 2024 on Monocle Radio. Hello there and a warm welcome to The Briefing, coming to you live from Studio One here at Midori House in London. I'm Emma Nelson, and coming up on today's programme. Tens of thousands of protesters call for the resignation of Serbia's president. We'll find out why and ask if he'll go. Also coming up.
Saying that, in my opinion, about Trump, we should not follow the rumors. The last things he said about Ukraine, so I come to Russia, saying that, yes, we're working for peace, but we know to have peace, we cannot abandon Ukraine.
Giorgia Meloni there at a gathering in Lapland of EU leaders where there are calls for more money to be spent on defence. We'll look at the latest business news and the arts headlines too. That's all coming up right here on The Briefing with me, Emma Nelson. Tens of thousands of people have taken to the streets of the Serbian capital Belgrade to protest against the president Aleksandar Vučić. They blame him and his ruling Serbian Progressive Party for the collapse of a railway station roof that killed 15 people. The opposition says the recently renovated roof of Novi Sad station caved in because of a poor construction job due to government corruption and nepotism. Well, I'm joined now by Monocle's Balkans correspondent Guy Delorney, who's been following the story. A very good afternoon to you, Guy.
Afternoon, Emma. Afternoon, everyone.
This is a very big protest, isn't it?
It is. It's apparently one of the biggest ever seen in Serbia. By some estimates, the biggest one ever seen in Serbia. So government estimates put the numbers of people who turned out in Belgrade on Sunday at about 30,000. But a protest monitor which looks at all the different protests which are held in Serbia and often comes up with figures which disappoint the protest organisers as much as they do the government. They reckon just about 100,000 people, maybe slightly more, turned up in Belgrade late yesterday afternoon for this silent vigil, this silent protest for 15 minutes, which was centred around Slavia Square in the centre of Belgrade. So that's really a very significant number of people, and it's certainly bigger than anything we've seen in the last decade.
And this is a call for what? For the departure of Aleksandar Vučić because of this collapse of this roof?
It's because of the way that he's handled it, really. I mean, because the collapse happened on the 1st of November, and it was shocking. I mean, just to take people back here, this was Novi Sad railway station. Novi Sad is the second city of Serbia. Its economy has been booming in recent years. It's a place where lots of young Serbian people have been moving to because they find they can make things happen there. And it's also been attracting people from other countries as well. We've had immigrants from Russia and Ukraine, for starters, recently as well. And Novi Sad was supposed to be one of the big stops on the Belgrade to Budapest high-speed railway, a real symbol of progress in the country, a real symbol of modernisation. And when you have a concrete canopy at that station, which was officially opened in July, not just collapse, but collapse and kill 15 people who just unfortunately happened to be underneath at the time, that caused a great deal of shock. And since then, people feel they haven't really had not just so much answers, but they haven't had accountability from the authorities. If this was such an important project for the authorities, why aren't people being held to account? Why aren't arrests being made? Well, some have been, but why haven't we had a full and frank opening up of what went on and why? And that's what people are really looking for here, as much as they're calling for the resignation of Mr. Vučić.
Because this is down to the fact that the allegations are is that this roof collapsed because it had been badly built. And the reason it had been badly built is because the government was involved in a corrupt way of procurement, and indeed nepotism was involved as well. Is that correct?
I mean, this is what you're seeing at the protests, Emma. People have been holding up pictograms of red hands, and the slogan has been blood on your hands, and another slogan has been corruption costs lives. Now, everybody knows that when you've got a construction project, it can involve tens, if not hundreds, or even billions of euros in a big construction project. So you're looking at a Belgrade to Budapest railway station, the construction of new railway stations, both in Belgrade and Novi Sad, this new line reaching between two capitals in Serbia and Hungary. You can imagine again, with a lot of construction projects, what the opportunities are there for graft, for contracts to be awarded to companies with connections and for officials to take kickbacks. And we've already had allegations since the railway station collapsed from people who were involved in the project that corners were being cut at Novi Sad railway station, that where there should have been concrete, there were concrete bags stuffed into cavities, and therefore the structure wasn't as strong as it should have been. Another allegation is that this canopy, which was part of the original structure of Novi Sad railway station and was heritage listed, that parts of its support were taken away for the reconstruction works, but they weren't put back again afterwards, that there wasn't sufficient oversight and care in the construction procedures. And these are all the things that people are tremendously angry about. Are you putting people's lives at risk for the sake of either A, political grandstanding, or B, siphoning off public funds for your own personal gain?
And with the spotlight on President Alexander Vučić, what has his reaction been?
Well, his reaction has been to these most recent protests that he's listening. He's happy to listen to the protesters. At the same time, he's also saying that he thinks that the protesters are being manipulated by the opposition because these most recent protests and the increase in numbers that we've had over the last couple of weeks have largely been driven by students. And the students got heavily involved because they were doing silent vigils outside their university faculties, marking these 15-minute silence for each one of the 15 people who died at Novi Sad railway station. And at one or two of these events, they were attacked by hooded goons. And the suspicion, of course, is that these hooded goons were sent by persons or organizations in authority to try and intimidate them. So that's when they sort of upped their involvement in all of this. And that seems to, if somebody did send the goon squad in, then it's backfired because the students have really catalyzed these protests. It's not surprising Mr. Vučić says he wants to listen, but I would be surprised if the students were, at the very least, not rather skeptical about this, because Mr. Vučić said a couple of weeks ago that he'd met the demands of the student protesters by releasing students who'd been arrested and by opening up the state archives for the documents connected with the railway station and its reconstruction. Students weren't impressed by that. They're probably not going to be impressed by Mr. Vučić now saying that he's listening just when these protests have reached a peak, the likes of which we haven't seen for a very long time.
Finally, Guy, how much trouble is Mr. Vučić in now?
Well, he will be nervous. He doesn't like to be out of control of any situation. And when you've got numbers like this taken to the streets, not just of Belgrade, but of other big cities like Novi Sad and Niš, that is a concern for Mr. Vučić. He's built his entire image on being the man who gets things done in Serbia and has been moving Serbia forward. Now, what the opposition is saying is, well, look at the canopy collapse. In effect, if you're equating yourself with the progress of Serbia through infrastructure projects, we're all underneath that canopy, literally and metaphorically. What else is going to go wrong? And this is a big worry now for Mr. Vučić. All the progress of the country definitely has made economically and in terms of infrastructure during his 12 years in government. That's all now being brought into question. And yes, he's got reason to be nervous.
Guy Delorney, thank you as ever for joining us on Monocle Radio. The time is just coming up to 9 minutes past midday. A look now at the day's other news headlines. Here's Laura Kramer.
Thanks, Emma. France will not announce its new government until after 1600 local time today, as the country observes a day of mourning for victims of the cyclone disaster in Mayotte. The nation is awaiting a new government to address its political crisis amid doubts about the survival of François Bayrou, the fourth prime minister this year. Honda, Nissan and Mitsubishi have announced plans to merge under one holding company in 2026. The CEOs of each company revealed the plans at a joint press conference, citing dramatic changes in the industry, including the shift to zero-emission vehicles and competition from China. Panama's president says the country's control of the Panama Canal is non-negotiable. It comes after U.S. President-elect Donald Trump threatened to take back control of the canal, claiming American ships are being overcharged. And Vietnam's largest city has launched its first metro line after years of delays due to funding shortages and the pandemic. Hundreds in Ho Chi Minh City boarded the train on Metro Line 1 for its opening day, which runs for 14 stops. City officials say it's a major step forward for public transport. Those are the day's headlines. Back to you, Emma.
Thank you very much indeed, Laura. Now, if there is such a thing as an informal gathering of world leaders, then it could be arguably found this week in Lapland. The heads of state of the likes of Finland, Sweden, Italy and Greece are all in casual attire. Think thick knitted jumpers and woolly socks. Their subjects, however, are still weighty. And to tell us more about this meeting, I'm joined now by Monocle's Helsinki correspondent Petri Bertsov. A very good afternoon to you, Petri. Welcome back.
Good afternoon, Emma. And it was quite something indeed to witness these world leaders sort of sporting wintry jumpers. And there's this one photo where they're sitting by the fireplace wearing woolen socks. And it's think about it. I just haven't seen something like that for a while.
It is so strange, isn't it? I mean, Giorgia Meloni in cream on cream with some lovely cable knit sweaters. And this is a sort of a major distraction, isn't it? Because as you say, we've all been so taken aback by what everybody's wearing that it's kind of distracted us from the fact that they are dealing with some massive points here.
Indeed. And then, add to that the fact that they met the Santa there and Santa was singing Christmas carols. They did a sauna. I don't know, maybe not together. I don't think so. They went to a reindeer farm. So it's all kind of a soft power exercise on Finland's behalf, despite the fact that they discussed some very difficult themes.
Right. So tell us a little more about, if there's any more to add in terms of the jollities, we'll come back to them later. But these are difficult themes which have been pervasive for a very, very long time. The idea of security and issues of immigration and what have you. So just talk us through what they've been discussing.
Yes, sure. So there were two main topics, one of them being security and the other one being migration. And those two are actually kind of interlinked from Finland's perspective, at least. And the reason why this was called the North-South Summit is that historically there's been somewhat of a, some let's say disagreements between countries such as Finland and Sweden, particularly Finland, and then southern countries, Mediterranean countries like Italy, Greece and Spain on migration. We all remember the Mediterranean migrant crisis and how sort of the northern European countries were pushing for Italy, Spain and Greece to adopt a tougher policy. And now, tables have turned in a way, not that the situation in the Med has changed, but, we've seen migrants in the north as well on Finland's border with Russia, but also the Baltic countries, Poland and so on, faced with the migrant crisis. So that was one reason Petteri Orpo, the Finnish prime minister, just wanted to bring North and South together. And then the other topic in terms of security was the discussions around the sabotage to the undersea cables in the Baltic Sea that we've seen a couple of incidents recently with the authorities saying that this was a deliberate sabotage and there have been Chinese ships involved. So basically, the country is sort of looking for a more resolute response. A lot of the critics have said that the EU's and NATO's response to these sabotage attacks have been somewhat lackluster. So those were the two sort of main topics. And then, of course, sort of discussing the incoming U.S. administration's comments about European NATO partners having to spend at least 5% on GDP. So that was also part of the discussions.
Have we had any official messaging coming out of this meeting, or does the informality spread and continue right through the way that things are communicated and indeed ideas are shared or plans are made?
To be honest with you, Emma, it was all very diplomatic, the language in the final press conference. Everybody agreed, as they always say, that Europe needs to spend more. They refused to really comment on the 5% number that Trump suggested. That's, of course, the current spending goal is 2%, and a lot of countries don't even reach that. So 5% is just out of this world, really. But they didn't comment on that. And then when it comes to this border security, they just basically all said that, stress the fact that border security is important. But the real elephant in the room here is, of course, that Finland passed legislation that allows for the so-called pushback of asylum seekers on the Finnish-Russian border, and the EU Commission is currently reviewing the legality of this deal. So I think Orpo's government was also sort of looking for support from those countries in the south that have faced migrant crises for some years now, but nothing concrete came out of it.
Indeed, I mean, I think Orpo was saying that what we have in common with the southern member states is that we're working to protect our external borders and those of the European Union as a whole. To what degree does this become a sort of an EU meeting?
Partly, yes. But I mean, of course, these countries alone, it's just 4 countries, and then the former Estonian leader, who is now the EU High Representative for Foreign Affairs, so Kaja Kallas. It's not the whole of EU that was represented here. Not even, of course, notable member countries, big member countries were not there. So, I mean, this is not an EU level meeting as such. But I mean, of course, if the northernmost and the southernmost countries can sort of agree on something, then it has a bearing also on the EU level.
Let's move on also to the fact that this is a big soft power moment for Finland.
It is, yes. And Petteri Orpo did not hide this aspect of the visit at all. He said that I wanted to invite this group to Lapland to show them what kind of place Finland is. And, Orpo continued saying that during their visit, these guests got to experience our northern climate, the polar night, and the beautiful nature of Lapland. So it was clearly also a marketing exercise for Lapland. And let's not forget that the place where this summit was hosted, namely the resort of Saariselkä, of course, has a long history of hosting high-level talks, both in business and in politics. And we remember during the Cold War, Finland met with Soviet leaders and high-level representatives there. And there's just something about meeting in these informal settings, sitting by the fireplace and talking about difficult issues. Because I mean, let's remember that leaders don't usually have a chance when they go to summits in Brussels or Washington. They don't get to discuss wearing difficult issues, wearing woolen socks and checking out some reindeers and hanging out with the Santa.
I wonder if it makes any difference, the fact that you're in more comfortable clothes.
It has to make a difference. I think so. And I have to say, I mean, you commented on Giorgia Meloni's outfit. I wasn't sure it was Loro Piana that she was wearing, but it was all white or cream on cream, even color coding, color matching the white woolen socks. It was quite something to behold.
It was. I recommend everybody go and have a look at Giorgia Meloni's socks. Never thought I'd ever say that. Petri Burtsov, thank you so much for joining me on The Briefing. You're with Monocle Radio. Time now for the latest business news. Ewan Potts is from Bloomberg and joins me once again on the line. Good afternoon, Ewan.
Hi, Emma.
We have 2 major car brands suddenly merging. Well, not suddenly merging, but recognising that actually competition when it comes to the future of electric vehicles is futile. Let's get together.
Yes, indeed. Well, listeners who've been around longer than a long time will remember the 1980s with the coming of the Japanese. There were worries in America and Europe and elsewhere that the entire car industry would be wiped out by the Japanese brands. They were cheaper, they were better, and they were taking over the world. Well, now that is the case with China, and it's Japan which is in the crosshairs. So Honda and Nissan have today taken a first historic step towards merging, hope to create a bigger player to survive the aggressive competition from China. The 2 Japanese makers signing an agreement today for merger talks. They held a joint press briefing just a couple of hours ago in Tokyo. They'll create a holding company and they'll list that on the stock market by the summer of 2026. And the holding company will include the brands of both Honda and Nissan. Those brands are going to survive, and they'll also wrap in Honda's large motorcycle business. Now, Honda's going to get to nominate the majority of the company's new board of directors. It's the much bigger of the 2 companies. And Mitsubishi, which is a quarter owned by Nissan already, also signed the memorandum of understanding, and it will likely be part of the wider group, although final decision yet to come on that. So the hope is that by combining Honda and Nissan, will create a group big enough not just to take on Toyota, the other Japanese car joint who make more cars than anybody else in the world, but also the likes of BYD, Geely Automotive and SAIC of China.
Indeed. I mean, it would create the 3rd largest car maker by sales in the world. We talked about Toyota being the absolute giant, and then Volkswagen. We'll come to them in a minute. But what will this do for the consumer, given the fact that we as drivers are now entering a world where we all have to move move over to electric vehicles at some point. And actually this inconsistency among brands is something that is very off-putting.
Yeah, it's tricky for the consumer. And this is part of the problem for the car makers, is a lot of consumers are not sure which to turn. Buying a new car is something which you probably only do every few years. So it is a big decision. And a lot of consumers are unclear about whether they should move to electric now or they should wait for the next car down the line. We know that in a lot of countries, the charging infrastructure is not quite there. Still, some drivers who drive long distances have worries about range anxiety, running out of charge before you get to your destination. And the other problem with electric vehicles is they are more expensive. They're considerably more expensive than the traditional cars. So it's very tricky for consumers, and that is affecting demand. So that's one of the problems for car makers, is that the demand for cars in general, but also particularly electric vehicles, is just not there. So as they spend huge amounts of money to make this transition, the demand picture is very difficult to map out.
And is there a sense that actually doing something like this, like a giant merger between Honda and Nissan, will actually have enough teeth to take on China? Or are we at a moment now where consumers forced to buy electric cars will suddenly go for something Chinese because it is there and because it is ready?
Yeah, well, the problem for the legacy car makers is a lot of these companies in China have really cut their teeth on electric cars. So their technology is very good. And like everything else from China, the costs are very low. So the price of these cars is really quite something. Some of them are just really measurably cheaper than the cars from the legacy car makers. So they've got this head start. And the other thing about electric vehicles is they're relatively simple. So all these legacy car makers have these huge car plants with billions and billions of capital invested over the years into these very complicated production lines, whereas producing an electric car is not that difficult. And so if you're making an electric car in Wolfsburg, like Volkswagen do, compared to an electric car made in a small town in China, inevitably the costs are going to be higher. So that is a very tricky circle to square to circle to square.
Let's move on to Volkswagen. It has had a very, very bad few weeks and months as actually the sort of the real effects of the electric vehicle market overtaking it are absolutely beginning to bite.
Yeah, different continents, same problem. Volkswagen is Europe's biggest car maker, and it's been grappling with how to deal with its bloated cost base, sluggish demand, and competition from China. We'll be getting more details of an agreement reached with the unions on Friday. It's reported that around 4,000 managers are going to give up their bonuses, equal to about 10% of their annual income next year and the following year, with smaller reductions going through to the end of the decade as well. It's all part of a restructuring agreement to slash costs, particularly at the namesake VW brand, and to avoid factory closures. We've had about 3 months of negotiations and the threat of continued strike action. Finally, VW says it won't close any factories. That would have been historic. They've never closed a factory in Germany before, but they have agreed to reduce capacity at 5 sites by several hundreds of thousands of units. So a big drawback in capacity. And they're also going to cut the workforce by more than 35,000 over the next 5 years, although crucially with no forced redundancies. And production of the VW Golf, rather momentous, is going to move from Wolfsburg, that enormous plant in Germany, to Mexico. Altogether, the plan is that will save them an estimated 4 billion euros a year over the medium term. So VW, like all car makers, is battling with very sluggish sales in Europe. Consumers concerned about the EV transition, under pressure from inflation, are just not going out and buying enough cars. Cars in the year to November were down about 2%. So they've basically been flat over the last year. There's not much the VW can do about that, but management have been clear that costs need to come down. But whether this will be enough to take on the Chinese giants, well, I think only time will tell.
Ewan Potts, thank you as ever for joining us on Monocle Radio. Finally, if you're short of something to do in the festive period, well, I'm not entirely sure what that means, let's have a look at what we could do in terms of art and culture. And who better to ask than the arts journalist Emma Rose Abrams. A very good afternoon to you, Emma Rose.
Good afternoon.
Thank you so much for coming into the studio to talk to us. Enormous news if you are a fan of Florence and the Medici and the Ponte Vecchio and that secret corridor which has joined the Uffizi Palace, or the Palazzo Vecchio, and the Pitti Palace.
Exactly, is reopening, and I think everyone's just so excited about this. I think they've spent 11 million, 10 million from the government and an extra million from a local wealthy person, and it's taken 8 years to kind of reconstruct it and make it safe, and we can now walk the path of the Medicis.
This was a secret path, wasn't it?
Yes.
The Medici went from the Ponte Vecchio, the Palazzo Vecchio on one side of the Arno River, and they could get to their other palace on the other side of the river without actually having to touch other people.
No.
And you'd imagine that it was quite a simple passageway, but this wasn't. This was stuffed full of art as well.
Exactly. It was the masterpieces. It's lined with masterpieces. And not only that, I mean, if people remember the Ponte Vecchio, the iconic bridge in Florence that we know from so many paintings, photographs, visits. It's the secret walkway of dreams.
Yeah, it is absolutely amazing. I think I remember that during lockdown they actually sent a camera down there and let us have a look. Yes, or when we couldn't go anywhere. Either it could have been a fever dream. I'm not quite sure. It's that funny thing. Does Florence need any more tourists, though? Any more visitors?
No, and it's actually quite difficult. The tickets are €43, I think, and you can then start off at the Uffizi, go through the secret corridor and end up at the Pitti Palace and then go through to the Bobbly Gardens.
Which is lovely.
So it's a stunning walk, but I think it's 25 people at a time. So
that's good, because my next question was anybody who's ever tried to get into a museum in Florence now knows. I think the last time I went to the Uffizi was about 2 or 3 years ago, and I had that awful realisation that I didn't want to go again because you didn't see any art.
That's not good.
You just got pushed through by other people, and it wasn't much fun. And it raised the bigger question as to how Florence manages such huge art events like the opening of the Vasari corridor.
Exactly, because people will just flock, because obviously it's iconic, and in the true sense of the word, it gets used so much nowadays. But it's a once in a lifetime opportunity. It's the opportunity to look at Florence through the eyes of the Medici. It's so loaded and so beautiful. But yes, I mean, not everybody can have this opportunity. And when you said that they took a camera down there, maybe this is something that, the internet can do well, and we can share these experiences virtually rather than sending hundreds or millions of people down it and then having to close it again in a year and rebuild it again.
Now, the Medici were very good at having rows with various people, and they were quite good at feuds, especially when it came to art. And that seems to be something which has persisted to the present day, but with Sweden.
Yes, it's Hilma af Klint, legendary Swedish artist, much loved. She was recently rediscovered or kind of brought to light. She's a spiritualist artist, and her work has this amazing kind of look to it. It's half abstract, half figurative. It looks incredibly contemporary, and so in the kind of, she was relaunched at an exhibition at the Moderna Museum a few years ago, and everybody kind of wondered and enjoyed rediscovering her work. But what this means for an artist's estate is that then people try and start to manage it in a different way. And I think there's a dispute on the board between the family and other unnamed board members, which means that they want to bring in a commercial gallery to manage aspects of the estate. And the family are really concerned because they feel like the spiritualist roots of the work are going to be interfered with, because these are meant to be series, almost kind of a series of visions that she painted, and to break them up or sell them individually, even though it's not really clear that that's what would happen, but the chance that it might.
And the interesting thing about the way that this narrative is being played out is that both sides, both the board and the family are saying this is a power struggle and her best interests are not being kept at heart. And both are accusing the other side of not preserving the absolutely beautiful legacy of Hilma af Klint, which sort of slightly muddies everything. It's not very dignified, is it?
It isn't very dignified. And when these things get public, it's very difficult. Obviously, so much doesn't get made public. We just hear the spats. We hear the kind of sound bites, and it's very difficult to get to the meat of it. The thing is that really it's about people having access to the art. And I think we could talk infinitely about whether or not selling things and preserving a commercial aspect to an artist does better good than preserving the body of work as a whole and keeping it unsold. I mean, I don't know if that's an argument anyone's ever going to win.
Emma Rose Abrams, thank you so much for joining us in the studio. And that's all the time we have for today's edition of The Briefing. The warmest of thanks to all my guests and to the producer Laura Kramer. Our studio manager was Elliot Greenfield. Our researcher is Gunnar Grunled. And a special edition of The Briefing is back tomorrow at the same time. But for now, from me, Emma Nelson, goodbye. Thank you for listening. And from me for now, a very happy Christmas to you.